Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where dark history, hidden stories, and unsettling realities come to light. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. The summer sun beat down relentlessly over the dusty grounds of the Alabama plantation, where the annual slave auction had drawn people from miles around. Merchants, plantation owners, and curious spectators jostled for position near the raised wooden platform that served as the stage for the day's grim commerce. The air was heavy with anticipation, a mix of sweat, dust, and the faint tang of iron from the chains used to bind the enslaved. Whispers floated among the crowd about the women and men up for sale. Some had skills that could enrich a household. Others were mere laborers whose worth was measured by the strength of their backs or the glow of youth. Among the crowd was one particular man, Jonathan Carver, a wealthy planter whose plantations sprawled across the fertile stretches of Alabama's Black Belt. Carver was no stranger to auctions. He had attended dozens over the years, his sharp eye and cold pragmatism honed for detecting value in human lives. As appalling as that might seem today, yet even he was caught off guard by the sight of a young woman who appeared on the auction block mid-morning. She was of medium height, with a lithe but strong frame, suggesting both resilience and endurance. Her skin, a deep warm brown, gleamed faintly in the sunlight, and her dark eyes held a calmness that seemed almost out of place in such a chaotic, dehumanizing scene. She stood with a dignity that commanded attention without demanding it, her posture straight, hands folded neatly in front of her, and her gaze calm yet observant of everything around her. Unlike many others, she did not tremble, and her eyes did not dart about nervously. She was unafraid, or perhaps too measured to betray any fear. The auctioneer, a burly man with a booming voice, began his usual patter. He called out the woman's supposed attributes: able-bodied, young, skilled in domestic work and field labor, healthy and obedient. The crowd murmured among themselves, evaluating the commodity in front of them. Starting bid, 1 cotton bale, the auctioneer announced, and a collective gasp rippled through the spectators. 1 cotton bale, an unbelievably low starting point for someone of her apparent youth and capability. "Are you sure, Jenkins?" one man whispered, nudging his neighbor. "1 bale? That can't be right. She's worth double, triple that." "Not if she's trouble," came another voice, laced with skepticism. "I wouldn't touch her for that price if she came free with the land." Jonathan Carver leaned forward, intrigued. Something about the situation felt off. How could someone so young, so skilled, sell for the equivalent of a single bale of cotton? That was barely a fraction of the value he would expect for a woman who could manage domestic duties efficiently, work in the fields when needed, and command respect among other enslaved laborers. Something in her bearing suggested she knew more than she let on, that she carried secrets hidden beneath that composed exterior. "Do I hear 2 bales?" the auctioneer called, raising his hammer. Silence. 1 bale going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Carver for 1 cotton bale. Carver's jaw tightened as the crowd erupted into murmurs, some impressed by his shrewdness, others incredulous that anyone would pay for a human being at such a trivial cost. Carver stepped forward, paying the required sum, his mind already turning over the possibilities. He had purchased her for far less than her apparent worth, but why? Was it mere misfortune, or was there something he did not yet understand about this young woman? As she was led off the auction block by a pair of handlers, the woman maintained her calm demeanor. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Carver, a subtle acknowledgement that she recognized him as her new master. Yet there was no fear, no pleading, only a quiet, almost imperceptible calculation. Carver noticed it instantly. He had seen many slaves, men and women who either cowered in terror or aggressively i.e. do assert themselves. This woman was different. She seemed to measure him just as he measured her, a silent exchange of power and perception occurring in that fleeting moment. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of transactions, as other men and women were bought and sold at varying prices, some fetching high sums for skill or youth, others selling for surprisingly low amounts due to age, illness, or perceived rebelliousness. But in Carver's mind, the image of this woman, the one bought for a single cotton bale, lingered like a shadow. There was something more to her than her outward appearance, something that set her apart from the ordinary. He led her to a small outbuilding near the main house, a place where newly purchased slaves were often held temporarily before being introduced to the plantation's daily rhythms. The woman's movements were graceful and deliberate as she followed, hands still folded, eyes scanning the environment without overt curiosity or fear. Carver watched her closely, noting every small detail. The faint calluses on her hands, suggesting labor, the slight stiffness in her posture perhaps from prolonged standing, and the faintly discernible intelligence in her eyes that seemed to indicate a mind accustomed to thinking ahead, to planning. "Name?" Carver asked, finally breaking the silence as they reached the small building. "Lavinia," she replied, her voice steady, clear, and without hesitation. There was a softness to it, yet a strength that made Carver sit up straighter. Her voice carried authority without arrogance, confidence without challenge. It was disarming. "Lavinia," he repeated, tasting the name. "You'll work for me now. I expect obedience, diligence, and discretion." She nodded once, curtly, and then fell silent again. Carver could sense that she understood the weight of his words, but also noted the faint spark in her eyes that suggested she would not be so easily subdued. He dismissed her for the day, instructing a caretaker to provide food and water and allow her a brief rest before beginning her duties. Even as he walked back to the main house, Carver's thoughts swirled with curiosity and unease. Why had she sold for so little? Was it the fault of her previous owners? Or was there something she carried in her past, something hidden that had led to this astonishingly low price? He could not shake the sense that she was more than she appeared, a thought that excited and unnerved him in equal measure. By afternoon, Lavinia was introduced to the other enslaved workers on the plantation. They watched her with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and curiosity. Among them, she spoke little, yet her presence commanded attention. Even the older, more experienced slaves seemed to recognize her as different. She was not overtly challenging anyone, nor did she appear to seek favor. She simply existed with a confidence that unsettled some and inspired admiration in others. As the day wore on, Carver kept a watchful eye on her, noting how quickly she adapted to the routines, how meticulously she performed small tasks, and how her demeanor remained consistently composed. It was clear that Lavinia was not an ordinary enslaved woman. There was intelligence, strategy, and perhaps even hidden knowledge in the way she moved and observed. Carver, despite himself, felt a growing sense of respect and a twinge of wariness. The day ended with Lavinia resting in the small outbuilding, while Carver sat in his office pondering the purchase. One cotton bale, a seemingly trivial cost for what he now suspected could be an invaluable and perhaps dangerous addition to his household. He knew that over the coming days he would need to pay careful attention, to watch and learn, for the young woman bought for so little was likely far more than anyone else realized. And so began the story of Lavinia, the woman whose auction price belied her true value, whose calm gaze and quiet intelligence would come to challenge assumptions, unsettle the household, and reveal secrets that no one at the auction could have anticipated. The bargain that had seemed so absurd at first glance was, in reality, the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the dusty grounds of that Alabama plantation. Morning came early on the Carver plantation, announced not by birdsong or gentle light, but by the sharp clang of a bell that echoed across the fields like a command. The sound cut through the stillness before dawn, stirring bodies from thin sleep and reminding everyone, free and enslaved alike, that the day belonged to labor. Lavinia was already awake when the bell rang. She sat upright on the narrow cot inside the small outbuilding where new arrivals were kept, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She had learned long ago that the first days in a new place were the most dangerous. Eyes watched more closely. Words carried more weight. Mistakes, however small, were remembered. She rose quietly, smoothing the coarse fabric of her dress. The garment was ill-fitting and worn, but she wore it with a composure that transformed it into something almost dignified. When the caretaker arrived to escort her to the main house, he paused, studying her as if trying to place something he could not name. "You'll be working in the house," he said gruffly. "Kitchen first. Don't make trouble." "I won't," Lavinia replied simply. Her voice, even in the gray light of early morning, carried a steadiness that unsettled him. He muttered something under his breath and motioned for her to follow. The Carver house rose from the land like a monument, wide verandas, tall white columns, and shuttered windows that reflected authority and wealth. Lavinia took it all in without staring. She had seen houses like this before. Not this one, but others built by men who believed land and people alike were possessions meant to affirm their status. Inside, the household was already stirring. The kitchen buzzed with quiet urgency, pots clanged softly, fires were stoked, and servants moved with practiced efficiency. When Lavinia entered, conversations faltered. Several women glanced up, their eyes measuring her posture, her face, the calmness with which she stood. This was not the usual look of a newly arrived slave. "You must be the new one," said Clara, the head cook, a broad-shouldered woman with stern eyes softened by years of survival. "Name?" "Lavinia." Clara nodded slowly. "You know your way around a kitchen?" "Yes," Lavinia said. "Cooking, cleaning, preserving. I can read recipes if needed." That last sentence landed heavily in the room. Clara's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "You can read?" Lavinia paused, just long enough to register the danger, just short enough not to appear evasive. "Some," she answered carefully. "Enough to follow instructions." No one spoke for a moment. Then Clara gestured toward a table piled with vegetables. "Start there. We'll see." Lavinia worked efficiently, her movements economical and precise. She did not rush, but she did not waste time either. As the morning progressed, Clara watched her from the corner of her eye. Lavinia asked no unnecessary questions, yet she absorbed everything: where tools were kept, how tasks flowed, who held authority and who merely enforced it. She learned names. She learned moods. By mid-morning, word had begun to spread quietly through the house. The woman bought for a single cotton bale was no ordinary hand. Upstairs, Jonathan Carver observed from a distance. He had positioned himself at the edge of the hallway, overlooking the kitchen doorway, pretending to review papers while listening. He watched Lavinia move, how she held herself, how others responded to her. There was no defiance in her behavior, yet there was something undeniably self-possessed about her. She belonged to the house now, yet she did not shrink inside it. By afternoon, Lavinia was assigned additional duties: assisting with laundry, organizing supplies, and helping serve the midday meal. Each task she completed without complaint. When corrected, she accepted it. When praised, she did not preen cheaply. Lavinia understood this before anyone else did. Attention, she knew, was both currency and danger. She moved carefully now, adjusting her behavior just enough to remain useful without becoming conspicuous. She spoke less. She smiled rarely. But even restraint could not erase what had already been seen. She knew too much. It began with language. One afternoon, while assisting Mrs. Carver with organizing correspondence in the sitting room, Lavinia was asked to retrieve a specific ledger from the shelf. "The one bound in blue," Mrs. Carver said. "Second row." Lavinia scanned the shelves briefly, then reached past the blue ledger and pulled out a darker volume. "This one, ma'am. The blue binding was replaced, after water damage." Mrs. Carver froze. "That ledger was repaired years ago," she said slowly. "How would you know that?" Lavinia lowered her eyes. "The stitching pattern is different, and the ink along the margins bled." Silence filled the room. Mrs. Carver studied her, not with anger, but with something closer to unease. "You notice a great deal for someone who claims only some reading." Lavinia said nothing. That silence spoke louder than any excuse. From that day forward, Mrs. Carver began asking fewer questions, and watching more. Among the household staff, the whispers grew. "She talks like she been taught," Clara murmured one evening while kneading dough. "She don't bow her head like the rest," another woman replied. "She knows things she shouldn't." Only Mary, the older woman, said nothing. She had lived long enough to recognize a survivor when she saw one. Lavinia wasn't careless. She was cautious to the point of calculation. Still, hints slipped through. One morning a traveling preacher arrived at the plantation to conduct a brief service for the household. Enslaved workers were permitted to attend from the back of the gathering space, under watchful eyes. The preacher read from Scripture, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm. At one point he paused and asked the room, "Does anyone recall the passage that follows?" No one answered. Then, softly from the back, Lavinia spoke. "For wisdom is better than rubies," she recited, "and all the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it." The room stilled. The preacher turned slowly. "You know your Proverbs well," he said, surprised. "Yes, sir," Lavinia replied. Jonathan Carver, seated near the front, felt something tighten in his chest. That was not rote memorization. That was familiarity. After the preacher departed, Carver summoned Lavinia again. "You were educated," he said flatly. She hesitated, just long enough to acknowledge the truth without surrendering it. "I was taught," she said. "By whom?" "By people who no longer have any use for me." That answer unsettled him more than defiance would have. Over the following days, Carver began asking discreet questions beyond the plantation. He spoke with the auctioneer. With merchants, with men who trafficked in information as much as cotton. The answers were evasive. She came from up north, one man said, maybe Virginia. Her papers were incomplete, said another. Seller was eager to be rid of her. Too eager, Carver muttered. One evening a guest arrived unexpectedly, Edmund Hale, a neighboring planter with political ambitions and a long memory. Hale dined with the Carvers, speaking freely of land disputes and family alliances. Lavinia served quietly, refilling glasses and clearing plates. As Hale spoke, his eyes lingered on her, not leering, recognizing. When she reached for his plate, his hand stilled hers. "Wait," he said softly. Lavinia froze, but did not pull away. He studied her face closely, his brow furrowing. "Where did you come from, girl?" "From where I was sent," she replied evenly. Hale leaned back, unsettled. "You favor someone I once knew." Mrs. Carver stiffened. Jonathan, Carver said sharply. "That's enough." Hale waved him off. No offense meant, just curious. But the curiosity had teeth. That night, Jonathan Carver confronted Lavinia more directly than before. "You were recognized," he said. "That is dangerous." "Yes, sir. Why?" She met his gaze fully now. "Because I belong to a past that was never settled." Carver exhaled slowly. "You speak in riddles." "Because plain truth is more dangerous." He studied her for a long moment. "Are you running from something?" Lavinia answered honestly. "I am surviving what was taken from me." That was the closest she had come to confession. The following week brought another sign. While sorting old letters in the study, Lavinia paused at one envelope. Yellowed, brittle, marked with a faded seal. Her fingers trembled slightly before she caught herself. Jonathan Carver noticed. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing, sir." He picked up the letter, reading the name aloud. Harrington. The color drained from Lavinia's face before she could stop it. Carver saw it clearly this time. "You know that name." She closed her eyes briefly. "Yes. Why?" "That family," she said carefully, "once held power far beyond what was visible." Carver's voice dropped. "And you?" "I was raised among them," she said. Silence fell like a verdict. "You are saying," Carver said slowly, "that you lived in a house like this one?" "Yes." "As property?" "No," Lavinia replied. "As something more complicated." That night Carver sat alone in his study, the Harrington letter open before him. The Harringtons were no ordinary family. Their name was tied to land grants, political favors, quiet scandals buried beneath generations of respectability, and now, somehow, a woman connected to them had been sold for a single cotton bale. It made no sense, unless someone wanted her forgotten. Outside, Lavinia lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling. She had hoped for more time, but the past had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. And now, the plantation itself seemed to sense it. Doors creaked more often, glances lingered longer, and conversations stopped when she entered the room. She had survived worse places than this, but survival, she knew, would soon require more than silence. The secret was waking, and once fully awake, it would demand a reckoning. The letter should not have survived. Jonathan Carver knew this the moment he unfolded the brittle paper beneath the lamplight. Ink faded with age, the seal cracked. Yet the handwriting remained unmistakable, elegant, deliberate, and confident in a way only people accustomed to authority ever wrote. Harrington. The name sat heavily on the page, like a ghost refusing to stay buried. Carver leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as memory and rumor intertwined. The Harrington family had once been among the most influential landholders in the region. Old money, political connections, whispered scandals quietly erased by influence and time. Their fall had been sudden. Lands sold, records sealed, a family name left intact but hollowed, and now Lavinia, a woman sold for a single cotton bale. The arithmetic of it made no sense, unless the price was intentional. The following morning Carver ordered the plantation overseer to ride into town and retrieve archived sale documents from the county office, anything tied to Lavinia's transfer. He framed it as routine bookkeeping, but unease gnawed at him. By noon, the plantation hummed with restrained tension. Lavinia sensed it. She had learned to read rooms long before she learned to read words. The servants spoke in softer tones. Clara avoided meeting her eyes. Mrs. Carver watched her as if measuring something invisible. And Jonathan Carver, he watched her like a man standing on unstable ground. That afternoon, Carver summoned Lavinia to the study again. She entered calmly, though her heart beat faster than she allowed herself to show. "Sit," he said. She did. He placed tea. He Harrington letter between them. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what your connection is to this name." Lavinia studied the letter, then lifted her eyes. "I was born under it." The words landed with weight. Carver's breath stilled. "Born a Harrington?" "Yes," she said, "but not one the family acknowledged publicly." He closed his eyes briefly. "Illegitimate. Conveniently so," Lavinia replied. "My father claimed me in private, educated me, prepared me." As the man dismounted, Harrington interests were stirring. They had sensed the disturbance, and they would not ignore it. As Lavinia prepared the sitting room, she felt the weight of generations pressing in. She had been sold cheaply because she was dangerous, because her existence contradicted the lies men told to preserve power. And now, whether she wished it or not, the truth had emerged. The question was no longer who she was. It was what would be done to silence her again, or whether this time she would finally speak loud enough to be heard. The lawyer stayed 3 days. That alone told Jonathan Carver everything he needed to know. Men like Silas Pembroke did not linger unless something valuable or dangerous was at stake. Pembroke moved through the plantation with polite restraint, reviewing ledgers, asking about land boundaries, estate transfers, and inheritance records that had been settled years earlier. On the surface it was routine. Underneath it was reconnaissance. Lavinia understood this instinctively. She watched Pembroke the way a chess player watches an opponent's opening moves, not for what they reveal, but for what they conceal. He spoke softly, listened closely, and never asked about her directly, which meant she was the reason he was there. By the second evening, Lavinia had made her decision. Silence had protected her once. It would not protect her again. If powerful men were stirring, then she would not wait to be cornered. She would shape the board before they finished arranging their pieces. Her strategy began, as it always had, with observation. She learned Pembroke's habits quickly, his preference for late dinners, his fondness for brandy, his habit of leaving documents unattended when he believed servants invisible. She memorized names from overheard conversations, partners, cousins, trustees. Harrington blood moved quietly through the South, and Lavinia knew where it flowed. One evening, as Pembroke reviewed papers in the study, Lavinia entered with a tray. "Mr. Pembroke," she said softly, "Mr. Carver asked that these be delivered." Pembroke barely looked up. "Leave them." She did, but not before noticing the document beneath his hand, a probate summary, with her name scratched out. That night, Lavinia lay awake, no longer afraid. Anger sharpened clarity. They were trying to erase her again, but this time they were rushing, and rushed men made mistakes. The following morning, she approached Jonathan Carver directly. "I can help you," she said. Carver looked up from his desk. "Help me how?" "By understanding what they want," Lavinia replied, "and what they fear." He studied her. "You would involve yourself further." "I already am involved," she said calmly, "whether I choose it or not." Carver exhaled slowly. "What do you propose?" She leaned forward slightly. "Access. To what?" "To correspondence," she said, "to conversations. Let them believe I am contained. Let them underestimate me." Carver hesitated, then nodded. That decision, more than any revelation, changed everything. Lavinia began to move differently after that. She remained obedient, deferential, but now she listened with intent. She positioned herself near doorways during meetings. She volunteered to copy documents. She asked harmless questions framed as ignorance. Pembroke noticed, but too late. One afternoon, while copying figures, Lavinia spoke casually. "The Harrington lands near Selma, those were sold under pressure, weren't they?" Pembroke stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Why do you ask?" "Because the numbers never aligned," she replied mildly. "They were undervalued." Pembroke smiled thinly. "You notice a great deal." "I was taught to," she said. That night, he confronted Carver. "She is dangerous," Pembroke said bluntly. "She understands too much." "She understands because she was educated," Carver replied, "as Harrington children were." Pembroke's jaw tightened. "Illegitimate. Ones were not meant to remember. Yet she does." Pembroke lowered his voice. "You would be wise to send her away." Carver met his gaze steadily. "You would be wise to explain why." Pembroke said nothing. That silence confirmed Lavinia's suspicions. They were not merely hiding scandal, they were hiding theft. Over the next week, Lavinia began assembling the truth piece by piece. The Harrington estate had been dismantled not because of misfortune, but because of internal betrayal. Trustees had siphoned land, documents had been altered, and Lavinia's existence, proof of private acknowledgments, education expenses, inheritance promises, had threatened exposure. Selling her cheaply had been a final precaution, a living receipt, disposed of, but receipts could be recovered. Lavinia began leaving subtle traces of her knowledge, a name dropped here, a corrected figure there, enough to make Pembroke nervous, but not enough to provoke open action. Men in power, she knew, panicked when they sensed exposure but could not see its shape. One evening, Edmund Hale returned again, this time alone. "You are stirring things you do not understand," he told Lavinia quietly while she poured wine. "I understand survival," she replied. "You will be crushed." "Perhaps," he said, "but not quietly." Hale hesitated. "What do you want?" Lavinia met his eyes. "Security. For yourself. And leverage," she added. Hale laughed nervously. "You sound like a Harrington." "I am one." That night, Hale sent a letter north. By the end of the month, whispers reached Montgomery. A Harrington heir lived, not publicly recognized, but alive. Pembroke's demeanor shifted from polite to urgent. He spoke of resolutions, of settlements, of handling matters discreetly. Lavinia let him speak. Then she acted. With Carver's permission, she copied a packet of letters, correspondence, between trustees discussing the girl problem years earlier. The language was damning, evidence. She hid the copies where no one would look, inside a hymn book. The irony pleased her. When Pembroke finally confronted her directly, his voice trembled despite his composure. "You will destroy yourself," he warned. "No," Lavinia said softly. "You will protect me." He stared at her. "Why would I?" "Because if I fall," she replied, "I will not fall alone." For the first time, fear flickered openly in his eyes. Jonathan Carver watched all of this with growing realization. He had purchased Lavinia thinking her a bargain. He now understood the truth. She was not a commodity. She was a catalyst. The plantation had become a chessboard, and Lavinia, once treated as a disposable piece, was now moving with intent, forcing others to react. That night, Carver asked her, "What happens next?" She considered the question carefully. "Next," she said, "they decide whether it is safer to recognize me or eliminate me." Carver nodded grimly. "And if they choose the latter?" Lavinia's eyes hardened, not with hatred but with resolve. "Then they will learn," she said, "that I am far more expensive than one cotton bale." Fear did not arrive at the Carver plantation all at once. It seeped in slowly like damp creeping up the walls. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore once noticed. By early autumn, the household no longer moved with its former rhythm. Conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Doors closed more carefully. Eyes lingered too long on Lavinia, then slid away as if contact itself carried risk. She had become the center of an unease no one would name. Mrs. Carver felt it most acutely. She had always understood the plantation as a structure, orderly, hierarchical, predictable. Lavinia disrupted that structure simply by existing, not by rebellion, not by insolence, but by knowledge, and knowledge, Mrs. Carver believed, was far more dangerous than defiance. "She should not be here," Mrs. Carver said one night, her voice low and tight as she sat acro. "As from her husband. Every day she stays we invite ruin." Jonathan Carver rubbed his temples. Sending her away would only confirm what others already suspect. Keeping her invite scrutiny. Selling her again would raise questions, he replied, and I will not be the man who hands her back to those who tried to erase her. Mrs. Carver's lips thinned. "Then you choose her over this household?" "I choose stability," he said evenly, "and right now she is part of that equation." Mrs. Carver turned away, resentment simmering beneath composure. Downstairs, the servants felt the shift as well. Clara noticed it in the kitchen first. The way younger girls whispered, the way older hands grew cautious around Lavinia. She watched alliances form and fracture in quiet corners. "People don't like storms," Mary said softly as they worked side by side, "even when storms come with truth." "She's not trying to be trouble," Clara replied. Mary nodded. Trouble don't always ask permission. Among the enslaved workers, opinions divided sharply. Some believed Lavinia's presence might protect them, that her education and connections could soften oversight or bring change. Others feared she would draw punishment, scrutiny, or retaliation. "She ain't like us," one man muttered, "and folks don't forgive difference." Lavinia felt it all, the glances, the silences, the subtle withdrawal of warmth from some, the cautious hope from others. She did not blame them. Fear made cowards of good people. But fear also exposed truths. One afternoon, a young servant girl named Eliza approached her in the laundry room, voice trembling. "They say men are asking about you in town," Eliza whispered. "Strangers." Lavinia folded linen calmly. "Who says?" "The overseer heard it. He said trouble follows you." Lavinia met the girl's eyes gently. "Trouble follows lies," she said. "I only reveal them." That reassurance did little to steady Eliza. By week's end, the overseer himself grew hostile. He watched Lavinia closely, correcting her unnecessarily, assigning her menial tasks beneath her station. Not to humble her, but to provoke her. She did not rise to it. That restraint infuriated him more than defiance would have. One evening, he confronted Jonathan Carver. "She's stirring unrest." "By doing what?" Carver asked. "By being watched." Carver's gaze hardened. "Then perhaps you should ask why." The overseer said nothing, but his silence carried threat. The breaking point came during supper. A visiting cousin of Mrs. Carver's, young, arrogant and careless, made an offhand remark after Lavinia refilled his glass. "Funny thing," he said lightly, "how some people forget their place when given proximity." The table fell silent. Lavinia paused, then continued her task without response. Mrs. Carver said nothing. Jonathan Carver stood. "That will be enough," he said coldly. "In my house, civility is not optional." Cousin flushed. "I meant no offense." "You meant familiarity," Carver replied. "And that is worse." The message was unmistakable. Lavinia had protection. That knowledge spread quickly, and protection breeds resentment as much as safety. That night, Lavinia found a note tucked beneath her door. "You don't belong here." She burned it without expression. Days later, a cup shattered near her feet in the kitchen. "Accidentally," someone said, then another, then whispers that she thought herself superior. Lavinia endured it all silently, but silence did not mean passivity. She watched who acted out of fear, and who acted out of malice. She noted names, and she waited. The household fractured further when a letter arrived from Montgomery. Jonathan Carver read it twice, then locked it away. Mrs. Carver noticed his pallor. "They know," she said. "Yes," he replied, "and they are nervous." That night Carver summoned Lavinia again. "The pressure is building," he said. "They are deciding whether to negotiate or neutralize." "And you?" she asked. "I am deciding how much chaos I am willing to tolerate." Lavinia nodded. "Then let me help you manage it." "You already have," he said quietly. As autumn deepened, so did the strain. The plantation was no longer merely a place of labor. It was a fault line, and everyone felt the tremors. One evening Mary took Lavinia aside. "Be careful," she warned. "When walls crack, they fall inward." "I know," Lavinia replied. "Why stay?" Mary asked. "You could run." Lavinia looked toward the dark fields beyond the house. "Running keeps you alive," she said. "Standing changes things." Mary studied her a long moment. "Then may God stand with you." The tension reached its peak when news arrived that another Harrington trustee had come south, unannounced, uninvited. Mrs. Carver wept that night. The overseer sharpened his cruelty. The servants held their breath. And Lavinia prepared, because tension, she knew, was not an ending. It was the moment before something broke. Jonathan Carver had always believed himself a practical man. He had built his wealth not through brilliance or cruelty alone, but through caution, knowing when to act and, more importantly, when not to. For years that instinct had served him well. He avoided political feuds, stayed clear of public scandal, and never placed himself at the mercy of powerful families. Until now, the presence of Lavinia had turned his plantation into a crossroads of danger and opportunity, and Carver stood squarely in the middle. The arrival of the second trustee confirmed it. Thomas Ridley rode in just after dawn, his horse lathered, his clothes immaculate despite the journey. He did not announce himself. He did not ask permission. He dismounted as though the land already belonged to him. Jonathan Carver watched from the veranda, jaw set. Ridley was a Harrington loyalist, one of the men who had helped dismantle the estate and profit quietly from its collapse. Which meant he had come for one reason only: Lavinia. Ridley wasted no time. "I assume you know why I'm here," he said once seated in the study. "I assume you'll tell me," Carver replied coolly. Ridley smiled thinly. A complication has resurfaced. A woman, Carver said. Ridley's smile faded. An error. Carver leaned back. Funny word for a human being. Ridley's eyes hardened. This error threatens settled matters, titles, land, reputations. And my household, Carver said. You've brought unrest with you. Ridley waved a dismissive hand. Unrest is temporary, silence is permanent. Carver understood the implication clearly. She is not for sale, he said. Ridley raised an eyebrow. Everything is for sale. Not this, Carver replied. Ridley leaned forward. Then you will suffer consequences. Carver held his gaze. So will you. That afternoon, Carver walked the plantation grounds alone. He thought of the ledger books locked in his study, of the letters Lavinia had copied, of the fact that, through a single purchase meant to be inconsequential, he now held leverage over men far more powerful than himself. But leverage cut both ways. If he protected Lavinia, he invited retaliation. If he surrendered her, he preserved his safety, but destroyed what little remained of his conscience. He had never thought himself sentimental. Yet when he pictured Lavinia, calm, measured, unbowed, he knew surrender would haunt him more than danger. That evening he spoke with Mrs. Carver one last time. This will not end cleanly, she said. If you protect her, we become targets. And if I abandon her, he replied, we become accomplices. She looked away. Sometimes survival requires ugliness. Sometimes, he said, survival without honor isn't worth it. She studied him for a long moment. You've already chosen. Yes, he said, I have. Meanwhile, Lavinia sensed the shift. Men like Ridley radiated intent, sharp, predatory, impatient. She knew this type well. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to erase. That night Carver summoned her. You must be prepared, he said. They will not stop. I know, Lavinia replied. You could still leave, he added. I would not stop you. She shook her head. Running ends stories, I intend to finish mine. Carver nodded slowly. Then we will face this together. The following morning Ridley returned, with a proposal, a document, a settlement. She disappears, Ridley said, and no one is harmed. No, Carver replied. Ridley's voice sharpened. You do not understand the scale of what you defy. I understand exactly, Carver said, which is why I refuse. Ridley stood abruptly. Then you force our hand. Be careful, Carver warned. I hold copies. Ridley froze. What copies? The ones that prove what you stole, Carver said. And who you silenced. The silence that followed was electric. Ridley's composure cracked just slightly. You would not dare. Carver smiled faintly. I already have. That night riders were seen on the distant road. Mrs. Carver packed valuables, the overseer sharpened his vigilance, and Lavinia prepared for the worst. But the attack never came. Instead, a letter arrived from Montgomery, a compromise. Recognition. Limited, discreet, but undeniable. Lavinia would be acknowledged as Harrington blood, without public ceremony. Protected, provided for, removed from immediate danger. The trustees would keep their lands, their names, their peace. Jonathan Carver read the letter twice, then handed it to Lavinia. She read it slowly. This is not justice, she said. No, Carver agreed, but it is survival. She looked up. And you? I lose nothing, he said, except the illusion that power is clean. Lavinia folded the letter carefully. Will you accept, he asked. She considered the question, not emotionally, but strategically. Yes, she said at last, on my terms. Carver smiled grimly. I expected nothing less. The next day Ridley departed without ceremony. The plantation exhaled, but nothing returned to what it had been before. Jonathan Carver stood on the veranda as Lavinia prepared to leave the house, not as property, not as a secret, but as something in between. You changed this place, he said quietly. So did you, she replied. He nodded. I bought you thinking I had gained something cheap. She met his eyes. You paid the price later. Yes, he said, and I would again. As her carriage rolled away, Carver felt neither relief nor triumph, only certainty. He had chosen the harder path. And for the first time in his life, he believed it had been the right one. The carriage wheels cut shallow lines into the red Alabama soil, as Lavinia left the Carver plantation behind. She did not look back, not because the place held no meaning, but because looking back had never moved her forward. For the first time in her life, she traveled not as property, not as a secret to be hidden or traded, but as a woman whose existence had been acknowledged, if not fully honored. The letter of recognition rested inside her satchel, folded carefully, its weight greater than the paper itself. It was not freedom, but it was no longer erasure. In Montgomery, Lavinia was settled quietly into a modest residence arranged through intermediaries. No announcement marked her arrival. No public acknowledgement followed. That was the agreement. Visibility without spectacle, survival without celebration. The Harrington trustees kept their lands, their names, their reputations, but they had lost something far more valuable: control. For Lavinia, life changed in subtle but profound ways. She was given an allowance, modest but sufficient. She was permitted education openly now, though framed as charity rather than restitution. She attended church services without being ushered to the back. She could walk the streets unaccompanied, though never unobserved. Power, she learned, rarely vanished, it only changed form. Jonathan Carver returned to his plantation a different man. The land remained productive, the ledgers balanced. Outsiders assumed the disturbance had passed, but something fundamental had shifted. He no longer believed the stories men told themselves about ownership and order. He had seen how quickly systems bent to protect lies, and how fragile those lies became when faced with one woman who refused to disappear. He adjusted how he ran the household. Small changes at first, less cruelty tolerated, fewer arbitrary punishments, a quiet insistence on restraint. Nothing revolutionary, but enough to be noticed, enough to matter. Mrs. Carver never spoke Lavinia's name again, but she felt the absence keenly. The house was quieter, emptier, as if attention had left, but taken something vital with it. Months passed. Then years. Lavinia grew into her new life deliberately. She read voraciously, history, law, philosophy. She studied how power moved, how institutions preserved themselves, how people like her were written out of records and footnotes, and then she began writing. Not publicly, not yet. She corresponded quietly with educators, ministers, and a small network of women, some free, some not, sharing resources, ideas, and protection. She funded schooling discreetly. She arranged safe passages where possible. She never announced herself as Harrington blood. She didn't need to. Her influence moved where her name could not. Occasionally, news reached her from the Carver plantation. Jonathan Carver had refused a political appointment. He had declined to participate in a land consolidation scheme tied to Harrington interests. People said he had grown cautious. Lavinia knew better. He had learned where power truly lay. Years later, when Jonathan Carver died, his will included an unusual provision: funds set aside for the education of those denied inheritance by circumstance. No names, no explanations. But Lavinia recognized the gesture. She attended his funeral from a distance. No one noticed her, which suited her perfectly. By the time the Civil War loomed on the horizon, Lavinia's quiet network had expanded beyond Alabama. Her letters traveled north and west, carrying knowledge disguised as scripture commentary or bookkeeping advice. She never put her full story to paper, not because she feared it, but because she understood something most people never did. Stories, once released, could be reshaped, misused, neutralized. Instead, she allowed fragments to survive: ledger corrections, margin notes, testimonies recorded under other names, enough for future generations to ask questions, enough to unsettle certainty. Decades later, after emancipation reshaped the nation in fire and blood, historians would stumble upon inconsistencies in Harrington records: a missing heir, altered documents, a woman referenced obliquely in letters as the complication. They would speculate, they would debate. Some would dismiss it as rumor. Others would see the truth hiding between the lines. That was Lavinia's final triumph. Not fame, not revenge, but disruption. She had been sold for the price of a cotton bale, because powerful men believed her life could be reduced to a transaction. They were wrong. Her existence had forced negotiations. Her memory had unsettled inheritances. Her quiet resistance had altered the trajectories of people who never knew her name. And that was enough. When Lavinia died, peacefully in her sleep, there was no monument, no public mourning, but there were schools still standing, families intact who might not have been, records corrected, questions preserved. History does not always remember those who change it, but it bends around them all the same. And somewhere, buried in the margins of a nation's past, the truth remained. A woman once sold for almost nothing had cost powerful men more than they could ever repay.